Greetings and peace, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. Today, I have the honor and privilege of being joined by my dear brother Matt Douglas from the Fatimiya Sufi order, who returns for part 8 in the series of dialogues and conversations that we've been having. And with part 8, brother Matt Douglas is going to cover a lot of elements that have surfaced lately in terms of what's been going on. And brother Matt Douglas will put things into context along with being vigilant and mindful on this path that we're on, and also talk about certain groups and what their agendas are and what he has experienced personally. So without further ado, Nur alaikum and welcome to our friend and brother Matt Douglas.
Nur alaikum, Salman. Glad to be here.
Thank you, brother, and please take it away.
Okay, well, with all the shit show, for lack of a better term, that's come out around these characters, Peter Moon and Douglas Dietrich, which got you away from them, fortunately, and several others.
Yes.
I'm kind of reminded of some of my own experiences some years ago. And now I've done on your channel, as well as on Sheikh Wahid's channel, many a reason, somewhat in just outright kind of bullet point form, even if not scripted, sometimes more anecdotally about my departure from the Baha'I Faith.
Yes.
Now, I've already kind of said a lot there. I'm sure there'll be things that surface, I'm sure, where I need to tell various parts of that stories again, for timeliness, or perhaps just some part I forgot that needs to come to light. But what I want to do with this one is, because even though I didn't leave the Baha'i Faith till 2016, I was pretty much on my way out close to 7 or 8 years prior to that. And while I was still enrolled, but not particularly involved, what the Baha'i lingo is active, quote unquote, I joined another organization, a political one, that I ended up leaving a couple of years later. And when I look back, there were a lot of similarities between the Baha'i Faith and this other organization, which was the Political Action Committee of Lyndon LaRouche, in shortly called LaRouche PAC. And so although I've done my part so far up to this point, best I could, to shed some light on what I observed from the outside, with your struggles with Moon and Dietrich.
Yes.
There were many other people who have experienced the same thing. Some right about the same time you did, some earlier, and certainly others are likely to go through it again.
Yeah.
It's a revolving door.
Absolutely.
You might say. And so I'm thinking about how getting away from the Baha'i Faith and going into LaRouche PAC I went, from a religious cult to a political cult.
Yeah.
And even though I'm kind of I can be a bit of a lone wolf, pretty independent, but nonetheless, no matter how independent you are, if you have any sort of heart or consciousness, you want to be involved in something more. You want to contribute to bigger effort beyond yourself. So I would imagine that although you've got plenty of other, your fingers are already in a bunch of other pies, but I don't know if that's necessarily the same thing for anybody else who's, leaving that debacle right now.
Yeah.
And so I kind of want to tell this, an expose on LaRouche PAC is well overdue for me. Not to mention the fact that I think it could serve your audience who might be listening now that I helped you expose like the bullshit on the time travel thing.
Yeah. They love that. That was absolutely wonderful the way you broke that down, and how these two con jobs are just basically running a scam and just fooling people. And that's the thing about this truth community, or this conscious occult community. There are many of them that are wolves in sheep's clothing. They're agents, and they're there to manipulate people, exploit people financially and in other ways. And people are knowing who they are, and they're being exposed for who they are. So their gig is up at this point.
Very, very much so. Although they'll probably, unless they actually get shut down and banned from, say, YouTube, they're likely to
Right.
keep, they're likely to keep conning people for a while.
Yeah,
But
that's right.
I'm doing this more thinking of some of the other folks that have also recently gotten away from the Moon Dietrich circle,
Yeah.
who might be looking for something else. And it's kind of be careful you don't go for what seems like a better version without the bullshit. It might just have the same bullshit. Okay. And so that's kind of want to tell the story about my involvement in LaRouche PAC and how it was, well, in a way, it was somewhat of a transition away from the Baha'I Faith. But the more I looked into what it was really about, there were just way too many parallels. So it's like I went from bullshit to bullshit with very similar, although slightly different flavors.
Yes.
So that's kind of why I think this particular story is timely right now. Now, both the Baha'i Faith and LaRouche PAC have a lot of things that look good on the surface, and there's some good people within. I'd say because I spent a significantly greater amount of time in the Baha'i Faith, that there are still to this day more people from it I still associate with, people who I want to convince to leave it. Whereas with LaRouche PAC, that number is very, very few. But well, I do hope some people will listen and I start asking some questions.
Yes.
Now, because these are both organizations that aren't too well known, there is misinformation out there about both. Some of which paints it even worse than it is, but that's not to say there's not a lot of bad stuff that people need to know about. And sometimes even the misinformation about them makes them look good in the sense that, oh, they're receiving this slander, there must be something to them. And you find out the overt slander, in a lot of cases, isn't true. But it's like it's kind of masking the stuff that people really do need to be warned about.
Yes.
So having been in the organization a couple years, I'd say I got to know it pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I do want to say, whereas with the Baha'I Faith being a religious organization, not that all religions or religious organizations operate this way, but with the Baha'i Faith, you actually do enroll and disenroll. With LaRouche PAC, it was somewhat different in the sense that I just started going to a lot of meetings, and someone said, well, members like yourself, and I'm like, well, I'm not really a member, never really become one. They're like, if you're coming to meetings and joining us in our activities, you're a member. So there was no like formal joining of it. And even after I left, I still tried to keep in contact with people, be friendly to the people who were friendly with me.
Mm-hmm.
Try to find points of commonality, although that's gotten a lot harder over the years. So even though in 2013 I read something where I'm like, I'm out of here. I still try to, and there's still one or two people who I have contact with who are able to stay friends regardless. But for the most part, just very similarly with the Baha'is, now that I'm gone, they just don't want to talk to me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one thing that was, because I was going into something that was political, and in politics, you want to, make a difference, so to speak. On the surface, LaRouche PAC seemed to have a lot more balls. In the sense that they'd have, and again on the surface, no trouble arguing with you and calling someone full of shit outright.
Right.
Which I think is, I think bullshit needs to be called for bullshit.
Of course. I mean, in this age of deception where everyone's just trying to appease everybody, it's very refreshing to see somebody that's actually standing for the truth and not afraid to get disliked over it.
Right. And there are some things that they say that are true and are valuable.
Right.
But what ended up happening was, because they are out of the mainstream,
Mm.
they have no problem getting into a debate with you if you're coming from the mainstream.
Mm-hmm.
Because they know how to debate that. They're used to it. You come with something that's not mainstream, but not them, they sidestep and stonewall, just like the Baha'is do.
Right. Right.
Okay, now let me actually say a little bit about what this organization is. Of course, it was started by a guy named Lyndon LaRouche, who was actually on, I want to say it was 8 times, I could have that figure a little wrong, was an independent candidate for the presidency. His VP picks always differed. I know one of the times his VP, I want to say sometime around 2000, was Jim Bevel. For anybody listening, that's one of the guys who was very close to Martin Luther King back during the Civil Rights Movement. But there were some big scandals with him towards the end of his life. A lot of, accusations of abuse from within the family. I don't know if they were true or not. But that did go down. But if you saw the movie Selma, he was the one who was portrayed by Common.
Got it.
Yeah. I don't know offhand any other of his VP picks. Now, at first, what LaRouche PAC tries to do is what they call reviving the American system, creating a dichotomy between the American system versus the British system, which is fairly accurate the way they portray it, and is kind of a part of history that isn't really talked about. What really made economically, not politically, with getting rid of royalty and things like that, but what on an economic level made the early American economics different from British economics. And, well, being from the US, you want to see good in where you come from.
That's absolutely right.
But in the end, you have to, I had to realize, you know what? Okay, they were both very racist. They're both forms of capitalism and exploitive. And even though, yes, there are some significant differences which have blurred greatly over the years, though the American system has a few qualities over the British one that would be what you'd call redeeming, it's not enough to be fully redemptive.
Yes.
Now, what the American system economics is often summed up in what's called protectionism. It's still capitalistic, but there's government regulations. The earliest form, of course, once the Constitution was ratified, was tariffs. The actual first piece of legislation passed after the Constitution was ratified in 1789 was the Tariff Act, which later became the Tariff Act of 1789 because there were all kinds of various legislations with tariffs as they kind of refined the system. But it was simply, I think it was 50 cents per ton, on all imported goods.
Right.
Thus, and the whole idea of tariffs, and I bring this up because a lot of people were fawning over Trump for wanting to bring tariffs, including LaRouche PAC. But it was very clear if you've studied what the early American economists like Hamilton were wanting to do with tariffs was completely different from what Dump wanted to do.
Right.
Because the early tariffs were the first tariff act just taxed all goods flat across the board. As time progressed, they might have put greater tariffs on particular goods, less on others, but it was always to target basically an industry, a product. It was not meant to target a country.
Right.
Hence Trump's whole BS trade war with China crap. The idea that if you put tariffs on imports, it keeps the industry at home, giving jobs to domestic workers. Now, granted,
exactly
going back 200 years, there weren't exactly labor laws, so those jobs are still pretty exploitive. But it was kind of a foundation for a principle of keeping things local, keep your food fresher too. And also, I'm going to rip off someone I don't like very much with what I'm about to say, but it's a decent summary. What's often not looked at in the American Revolution, not that I'm big on either side, because both sides got a lot of poor Slavs to die for them. But you had a fight between the rich Americans and the ultra-rich Brits.
Yes.
And so what basically happens, and the reason why is because the rich want to become the ultra-rich. The ultra-rich want to stay the ultra-rich and don't want to let anybody else in the club. Or they're not quite as ultra-rich as before. So in short, the rich Americans wanted things to change. The ultra-rich Brits did not want things to change. And what that led to, because it was very much after, it was very soon after the Constitution was ratified. Because during the Articles of Confederation, things were getting so screwed up that the U.S. was on its way to being a colony. And the Constitution reversed that with tariffs. States had tried putting individual tariffs, but then sailors would just sail, into a port in another state where they didn't have to pay the tariff.
Right.
Making it pretty useless. So and that's where the whole, because they wanted things to change, even if it was a fairly selfish change that did not include everybody the way they said it did. That was kind of and because you had statesmen, especially Ben Franklin, who was a scientist, that's where you get the American mentality of we can do anything, the sky's the limit. And when the British saw that they were actually starting to put a system in place that they couldn't challenge so easily, and that was starting to work, it was in the 1790s that Malthus published his shit. Malthus being, for anyone listening, the British priest who revived and codified and actually gave the term, got his name attached to it. We now call it Malthusianism. The whole, it had been around for thousands of years among the elites, the whole bullshit idea of overpopulation. If anybody's seen Avengers, that's Thanos. Yes. So whereas the Americans continued to build, but had its repercussions in the exploitation of labor, the British went out and colonized, but used the concept of overpopulation to justify their slaughter.
That's right.
Nowadays, people want, and LaRouche, though, tries, and his whole organization, he passed away actually a few years ago. But what they try to say is, let's revive the American system and stop, this British corruption of it. And even though there are some people among the ruling class who might fall into one camp or another, it's kind of bullshit nowadays to see those camps as fully separate. More or less, it's two different philosophies, and the bourgeois, various members of the bourgeoisie will adapt one philosophy or another, whatever's convenient.
Yes, that's correct.
So to say that two camps are still fighting it out, really doesn't quite apply anymore. People will switch camp. The rich will switch camps as they see fit. Where this notion of the American system versus the British system in LaRouche PAC gets very toxic, is that they ignore every other system.
Right.
And anything that will challenge what they perceive to be the American system, or even the U.S. itself sometimes, despite them calling the U.S., especially things like Wall Street, which are British economics, fair enough, but calling it corrupted, with the British system. Any philosophy that is neither one, that does criticize the American system, LaRouche PAC will find some way to label it as a British contrived attack on the US and the American system.
That's right.
Okay, and not to say that the Brits or the Americans don't play those kind of covert games. Certainly they do. But it completely delegitimizes anyone else. You can, and it shouldn't be too much of a stretch to see how this is extremely racist.
Yes.
Okay, I don't think I need to explain that any further because both the American and British systems were founded by a bunch of rich whiteys.
Yeah.
Okay, I think I can save any more detailed explanation on that one.
That's right.
But if you want to give a few examples, one thing that I found out very shortly when I started just researching, and it was very shortly after I decided I'm out of here, was I researched what they said about the move bombing. Figure this is a good subject to bring up, you being in Philly.
Yeah.
Okay. If you read their articles, they make no mention of the fact that the bomb that was dropped by the Philly PD killed women and children, and called MOVE a terrorist organization.
Yep. And they never apologized for it either.
Nope. Further, they tried to say that John Africa was a British agent.
Yep.
Okay, now what it does, and I'm not saying there weren't some games that were played, but by saying it the way they do, they take away any legitimacy of very legitimate and very righteous black rage. They did the same thing when Hugo Chavez died. Tried to say, and when you actually read what they're saying about the various connections to Britain, sometimes they're not substantial. If you read their article on Chavez, trying to call him British just because he went after the U.S. and was a unrepentant socialist. When you read the supposed connections he had to Britain, it reads like Lone Star. I am your father's brother's cousin's uncle's former roommate.
Yeah.
So they'll stretch that one.
You know what's interesting, brother Matt? Just to add a quick point here is, I've had interactions with both the American front and the British front, and I realized that conflict that they had since the Revolutionary War still exists to a certain covert extent, where they're always trying to one up each other in global influence and in other aspects. So they're still technically at war with each other in some kind of way that your average person is not told about unless you really, really look into it and actually experience it.
Oh, true. I'm not disagreeing with that, but whereas they're lining up the systems,
yeah,
I don't think it's so much the systems anymore because they'll pick and choose.
Yes, that's what it is.
Okay, like for example, now it's the American sky's the limit kind of attitude. and you can even directly tie it to a few probably certain influential people, such and LPAC is right, right about this, that you can make some very strong connections to American visionaries like, especially Ben Franklin, being both a scientist and a statesman, and having at least some ideals for, geez, if we can invent more machines, not so many people got to spend so much time in drudge labor. And Hamilton created an economics to do that, but it was what for that time could have been called trickle down. There wasn't a system in place to really see to it that the infrastructure development the U.S. worked on was there for the poor. The roads might have been public, but it's not like they were doing it, doing any special thing to get somebody, to get a poor person a horse. So again, there's still some like the old family rivalries, but Britain was, despite using the Malthusianism to justify their colonial slaughter, they still were happy to go ahead and build their own railroads quite quickly. Now that later became a big point of contention as to how they got built, because then originally the U.S. railroad system was really just at first going from the port to the interior. A lot of the goods being shipped to England and Western Europe, but eventually they got the bright idea of building railroads north-south so that the various U.S. states could trade with each other, stimulating their own economy. And that's actually one of the big things that led to the Civil War, where Britain realized, hey, they built too much railroads, they ain't going to be dependent on us buying their shit. Hence why if you imagine the American, well, first of all, it's interesting that most people don't know, but the American flag is, with the exception of the upper left, looks just like the flag of the British East India Company.
That's absolutely right.
The world's first megacorporation. You just have where the American flag has what's now 50 stars on a blue background, and that number might have changed, but you just simply, with the flag of the British East India Company, you had the flag of Great Britain there, which is almost the Union Jack minus the St. Patrick's saltire that includes Northern Ireland. So it's simply a combination of England and Scotland. So it's not quite the Union Jack. But if you take the American flag and then you think of the Union Jack, and you think, okay, how would you take the outlay and colors of the American flag and then kind of warp them back into the form of the Union Jack? It's not coincidental that you get the Confederate battle flag.
Right.
Because that really was like a third war for independence. The South would have been in so much debt if they won. It would have pretty much been a colony again. And it was British agency that was prodding things to get the country fighting itself.
Right.
So going over this history is something that LPAC does try to expose to the world, and I think that's pretty good. But as you can see, it's very biased with the same racism that Britain had.
Of course.
What was my when I read this, it's like, okay, I am definitely out of here, and I'm going to read it to you. And I found it sometime in 2013. Granted, it was originally written back sometime in like 77. This is an organization that's been around since like, I want to say sometime in the 1960s. I was looking for what they said about Native Americans, and I found it, fortunately or unfortunately. So here's what caused me to say, I am out of here.
Right.
Okay, I'm just going to read verbatim. This is from originally written in, I think, 77. It was LaRouche PAC reprinted it in a book or pamphlet by the name of the case for Walter Lippmann. I have no idea who Walter Lippmann is, honestly, but let me just read this. It says, quote, "What of such precedents as the Texas affair and the Mexican-American War? Taking the character of the 1828 to 1860 period as a whole into account, there is a double aspect to both affairs. Some will not be pleased by what we must properly say on this account, but truth is truth, however it may offend liberal prejudices. The founding perceptions upon which this nation was established were those of the idea of progress being in italics. That means in practice that the nature and rights of nations and cultures are not, quote, culturally relativist." Doesn't sound too bad at that point. But then, in italics, "we do not regard all cultures and nations as equally deserving of sovereignty or survival. That is not an imperialist policy. It does not specify a policy of U.S. acquisitions of the areas occupied by more backward nations and cultures."
Right.
You can already see where it's starting to go here, but I'll continue. "It is rather a statement of U.S. national self-interest in the realization of the proper rule of the idea of progress as a universal natural law governing the entirety of the human species. And anyone who does not recognize such a clear statement of principles in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, written predominantly by the same set of authors approximately 2 decades apart in time, must be indeed an illiterate. Was it then correct for the American branch of European humanist culture to absorb the territories occupied by a miserable, relatively bestial culture of indigenous Americans?" Absolutely. That absolutely was me quoting them. Not just saying that.
And that's absolutely not good. And I saw the red flag that you have mentioned of what they try to cover up in their fancy language, but at the same time, they're degrading indigenous peoples.
Exactly. And that was actually the thing that some years later caused me to actually leave the Baha'I Faith, and I might have read it before, but it didn't hit me, where Abbas, the son of Mirza Hussein Ali, said that the North American continent was transformed thanks to the coming of Christopher Columbus.
Yes.
So it's like, well, if I left one organization for what they said about the Native Americans, and I find another organization saying the same thing, I'm out of there.
Yep.
So, and because earlier on, before I had read what I just read to you, the hints should have been there, but they'll go ahead and slam Andrew Jackson, who rightly deserves it, for amongst other things being a quote unquote Indian slaughtering thug. But then they'll praise Ulysses S. Grant for his wanting to, subjugate them in a kinder, gentler way. Yeah, so there's a huge element of white saviorism.
Exactly. Now, do you think aspects of the British Crown still influence or control America to a certain extent? Because if you look at the Treaty of Paris of 1783, which officially ended the Revolutionary War, and when the founding fathers were there signing this treaty with the crown, it tells you in there that in the name of the most holy and undivided Trinity, I'm quoting the treaty here, the some aspects of it. It having pleased the divine providence to dispose the hearts of the most serene and most potent Prince George III, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, defender of the faith, Duke of Brunswick and Lunenburg, Arch-Treasurer and Prince-Elector of the Holy Roman Empire and of the United States of America. So check this out. He's referred to as the Prince-Elector of the Holy Roman Empire and the USA, to forget all past misunderstandings and differences that have unhappily interrupted the good correspondence and friendship. So basically here it's telling you that the crown it still has some kind of an influence. So what are your thoughts on that, on what is said here in the Treaty of Paris?
Well, I haven't read that before. I'll have to give it another look. Given what I learned in LaRouche PAC, which I will, some of their stuff is historically accurate, even if from a very warped perspective, I can tell you that they absolutely despise the British Crown.
Right.
I don't get any complaints with them for that. They won't necessarily say that it's still part of the U.S., but they will talk about how the U.S. is constantly getting sabotaged by British agents.
That's true. That's true.
It was, now what they call a British agent probably wasn't, might have been a patsy who just kind of got, because like I said, they'll call Andrew Jackson a British agent, because he shut down the National Bank. And while I can definitely agree with that, their condemnation of Jackson for what he did to the Seminoles and the Cherokee is not nearly strong among them as they're getting on him for being a quote unquote British agent.
Right.
Even if he was more patsy. Now and there was a rivalry a very overt rivalry between Britain and America right up until the time of Edward VII and Theodore Roosevelt. That's when it kind of blended into the Anglo-American Empire we know today.
That's right.
There might have been skirmishes. The only real time where you could see a distinction between the two after that was the FDR era.
Right.
And it's very obvious that, just because of the British Crown's money, anyone who thinks that they're just figureheads with that kind of money is just an idiot.
That's absolutely right. Those people haven't worked a day in their lives, and how do they do what they do, where they have a unlimited supply of money to live a lavish lifestyle, travel the world, not have to work, be treated as celebrities wherever they go? So there is something to it besides being figureheads.
Even in the British there is no British Constitution. They'll say there is, but there isn't. But in British law, the crown is still the sovereign power.
That's right. And even in Canada and New Zealand and Australia and other Commonwealth territories, including probably some of the states here in America that are Commonwealths, are still influenced by them to a certain extent.
Yeah, well, I mean, technically, as far as I know, and I'll have to check into what you read from the Treaty of Paris, but but all the British Commonwealth nations are still, ultimately controlled by the Crown, and the Crown can sack the Prime Minister at will of any British Commonwealth nation at will. It's done through the Governor General, was done in Australia. Now, actually, Sheikh Wahid posted a nice little article that it was actually more CIA influence, from the U.S. prompting the removal of Gal Whitlam in the 70s. But still, it was the Governor General, I forget his name, who made the decision, and they answer to the Crown. So, when Canada celebrates Canada Day, as an independence, it's kind of a farce.
Yep. Even my home country of Pakistan, and that subcontinent area known as the original India, which is Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, a lot of their leaders are also educated and groomed in England. So whether you look at the Sharif dynasty in Pakistan, or the Bhutto, or the Zardaris, or all of these people that have dominated the political landscape of the nation and looted its wealth and kept the people in poverty, still the same system of the British Raj. I mean, they can tell you you're independent and you're free, but it's easier to control a slave when you tell them they're free. But at the end, all of the leaders are groomed and trained in London, and then they get sent over to these countries to take over the leadership.
Yeah, and it doesn't really matter. In a sense, it doesn't really matter if a British colony is officially independent now or not, if they're still answering to big money coming out of London or out of Wall Street.
Absolutely.
Now, granted, I mean, yes, I'm happy to see that Barbados broke away from the British Crown. The fact that the Governor General even supported it, meaning he's out of a job now, was a good sign. But does that mean they're going to be fully independent? We'll see. I'm sure they'll still have a fight on their hands for that one. Jamaica is talking about that now too. We'll see what happens with that. So like I said, and these are some of, the decent things you learn in LaRouche PAC about how a lot of colonial systems still operate. They don't talk about the French too much, even though they're pulling the same game. I won't say they don't talk about the French, but they have the hard on for Britain, and try to use that to cover. It's like they use Britain's sins to cover America's.
Yep.
When really it's ultimately all a ruling class, and there's imperialism in London, there's imperialism in DC, there's imperialism in Paris, there's imperialism in Moscow now, and has been 30 years. So it doesn't really, nowadays it doesn't really matter too much. But by trying to focus, now one thing they do, because these philosophies early on differ, okay, and they are very good at exposing the imperialist corruption of environmental movements in the form of things like Malthusianism, which still has its proponents to this day. But they'll kind of go to the opposite extreme of wanting to say build, 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 but calling climate change all a hoax. And calling it, and some will even try to call every environmentalist a Malthusian. Now, as having been in there are some people in the organization who don't think that way and do have kind of a balanced view on the environment, but their PR department in that one could really use some work.
Definitely.
So, because I know that, they'll say, well, actually the temperature was 1 degree cooler, and last year. NASA said it. I'm like, how'd they measure it? Did they measure the whole Earth at once and every temperature? It's like, how do you get those numbers? Of course they don't have anything for that. I just know that if you want from me what is the quote unquote evidence. I don't want to necessarily call it proof, but the personally things that I've personally experienced as evidence of global warming. When I first moved to Virginia from California in 2007, the date in the almanac, and it seemed to, not like our eyes are so finely attuned to color that, and mine are pretty good in that department, that we'll know the exact date of, if the almanac is right, about when the fall foliage is at its most colorful. They gave the date of either October 10th or October 12th. And this was in 2007, and it seemed like they were pretty accurate. When I was working mostly in Virginia, some in PA, in 2019, the leaves in Virginia didn't even start changing color till almost November.
Right.
So if you want evidence that something's going on with our climate, that's it.
That's
and they'll
that's
do
absolutely right. And people just don't
yeah,
pay attention.
and they'll do, LPAC will do a good job of exposing big money organizations that twist the climate change for their own political purposes, and there's plenty of that. A good example is, say, the World Wildlife Fund, which pretends to care about animals, but really is creating nature preserves in developing countries, so those people don't get access to the resources. Then they'll undeclare it once some big Western company is ready to go in and rape the area. But to say it's outright denial, is that it's just a hoax and denying it, is not at all recognizing things like the Dakota Access Pipeline and the dangers putting it through indigenous territory were likely to totally wreak havoc with the lives of the people there. So it's very much so they go like all the way towards the American side, realizing it's not to say that the British one's right, but it's also, but by the British being twisted doesn't mean the American side isn't twisted either. But it's very easy just coming from the US and wanting to find excuses why why maybe it's not so bad, but eventually things catch up. And I'll go through, they are pretty good on some of their economic policies. I got some experience actually, as an amateur lobbyist, actually meeting with, some, not with Congress people themselves for the most part. Usually they have their aides talk to you, but you realize these idiots, are no better than me, anything particularly dumber.
Yeah.
But I was part of some campaigns they did to say reinstate Glass-Steagall. If you don't know what that is, that was the firewall that was enacted Great Depression era, that was taken down in '99, that put up a firewall between commercial and investment banking. Officially, that firewall still exists, but what the Graham-Leach-Bailey Act of '99 did was basically make it so that a commercial and investment bank could be more or less brother and sister corporations owned by the same parent, and it also had like insurance companies to come in and just create a whole bunch of more casino economics.
Right.
Also, I was involved with them during the build-up to the almost invasion of Syria. And granted, you got to give credit, as messed up as they are, you ultimately got to give credit to the Russians for stopping that. But, I was, part of some delegations that went in to, meet with congressional reps to stop it. So I got some experience there. But let me go into some other things that need to be known about LaRouche PAC that are not good. the reason why I'm very glad that I am away from this shit now is because they have become full-on Trump-tards. Right. Now, they didn't give a whole lot of attention to Donald Trump during the election times. They kind of considered him just an idiot. Not necessarily dangerous, and I think they kind of underestimated his dangerousness there. But, you know, they just saw him as kind of a typical buffoon. When the whole Russiagate thing broke, not too long after Trump won the election, they went full-on Trump card, and here's why.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Lyndon LaRouche himself did serve some time on starting back.
Your voice is your voice quality just got a little low. Just please repeat that again, Brother Matt.
Okay, LaRouche did serve some time. I think it started late 80s, early 90s. And it was for the charge ended up being for like credit card fraud or something. And it really was in many ways, you know, a trumped up charge. I don't think he was really guilty of that, but he was anti-establishment enough at the time that he attracted a lot of ire. So if you read some about the trial, it did seem quite a lot to be a kangaroo court that was just looking to hang him. But here's the thing: his prosecutor was Robert Mueller. Okay. It was actually his defense attorney was Ramsey Clark.
Right.
So when Russiagate broke, and it was announced that Mueller was the prosecutor, rather than look at Mueller as just a hard-ass prosecutor,
right,
they immediately went to, oh, this is all a big British conspiracy against Trump. And that Trump's a big American hero, blah, blah, blah. And they have not literally, fortunately, but, you know, metaphorically sucked Trump's dick ever. You know, and even just becoming very much like the rest of the idiot Trump cards you see, who will try and rationalize, you know, things like just saying, you know, let's try and inject bleach. I mean, no, I mean, not to mention even getting into his racism, which they're part and parcel of, because, and the LaRouche PAC organization, you know, it has its members of all hues, but of course it's still a white organization that has values. One thing, and this is a very odd dichotomy. On the one hand, they'll actually do their meetings with, you know, Congress people, thinking that, well, you know, they're still human, there's still some good in them. Let's try to talk, let's try to reason.
Yes.
Yet they have a complete aversion to any form of popular music. Calling it all a big British conspiracy. Now, I don't know any music fan, and pretty much every human being alive is a music fan, that doesn't think on some level that modern music is over commercialized shit, and it keeps getting worse in that department. But people also, you know, everyone also knows that there are plenty of artists who are not trying to just make a buck and have some creative integrity in all genres. And that there's nothing evil about liking a stupid pop song.
Yes.
You know, it's harmless. but they act like, you're corrupt. They actually think you're corrupting yourself if you listen to the Beatles. And you can see this this very odd cognitive dissonance where on the one hand, they'll go politicians who are corrupt as hell, hoping to find the human goodness, but can't see the human goodness in an artist who's just trying to play a little catchy tune to maybe make someone a little less stressed.
Right.
Just have a little bit of escape. Because their creed is also very much intellect good, emotion bad, which is a theme running through their stuff. And when you consider, because I'll make a parallel to Dietrich here, a lot of people send them money. And so you have not only LaRouche himself, but, back when he was alive, I think the organization still has it, because his wife, surviving wife, his widow, is more or less the de facto head of the organization now. They have a big, complex in Loudoun County, Virginia. Plus, they have their offices in Leesburg. I've been to their central offices in Leesburg plenty. Knew some people there. Some were okay people, some were arrogant assholes. But when you see that this is an organization that does have money coming in, and hence can pay people to be full-time activists, which is something a lot of people want to be. What it does, though, is you get these, paid activists who it's their job, who I'm not saying they live in luxury, but they eat poor. You combine that with an intellect good, emotion, and sensation bad, or at least lesser, then what you get is, among a lot of members, a real lack of empathy with those who are actually struggling. Now, they might wax on about how they're with the people just like any other political force tries to say that, but will, again, shit on people for what music they like.
Yep, that's right.
Also, they were very much against, and still are against, say, the legalization of marijuana. Thinking it'll just cause people to get high and then accept their enslavement more, blah, blah, blah. When in fact, because they're getting paid to do what they like and other people are stuck in the grind, they don't get that, and they don't realize that, hey, sometimes the conditions of people are such that they want to get away from that pain, and that's human, and if they smoke a joint to do that, who cares?
Yes.
Okay, and not to mention the fact that they won't even get into the racial disparity and who gets locked up for it. They'll talk about one thing they will often talk about is returning to quote unquote classical culture. And it's easy to see how that could be an interesting term at first, given, how the school systems are going down in the U.S. Wanting to return to classical education. But you spend enough time in the organization, which you realize that classical is their dog whistle for white.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Because they'll talk all about the various their Renaissance heroes, but start talking about the philosophies of someone else. You start talking about the philosophies of, say, Marcus Garvey. They don't want nothing to do with it.
That's exactly right. And look at the school system. They're not going to tell you about the British elite who were a part of the Hellfire Club, who massacred 100 million Indians in the British Raj, which was collectively the people of Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. They don't tell you about King Leopold and how he massacred millions of Africans for rubber. They don't tell you about the 100 million indigenous Americans that got massacred here. So history
Yeah,
is not telling you the full truth, and we see that education system crumbling along with these cons like Dietrich and Moon and all of these other con jobs that have fooled the people for so long.
yeah, and it's interesting you brought that up because you can at first get really attracted to LaRouche PAC because they will call out, okay, the Hellfire Boys who killed 100 plus million people in India. They'll even cite the specific famine because the British engineered, I think it was 4 different famines, maybe more, in India, and they'll call out that one could have been anywhere from 30 to 80 million alone, the one I think in the 1880s. And they'll call out King Leopold for what he did in the Congo. They won't
Right.
call out any U.S. president for what they did to the Native Americans and how they want to use the whole of North America and South America as their backyard.
Right.
Okay, so it's and when you start seeing that it's limited, it's like they're focused on one aspect of imperialism, not now. And frankly, the way they're talking about, because they are very much on Russia's side in this whole Russia-Ukraine thing right now. And it seems like they are very much lining up with the whole Dugan crowd.
Yes.
Now there also one of the things they do also they do really like what China's doing, and I somewhat do. I watch to see, because China's not a monolith. So what they're doing can be used good or used bad. It's certainly better than what America or Russia is doing, but they, just like the Duganists, will throw the term Eurasia around.
Yep.
Okay, which I'm thinking there may be a very big connection there, but it's trying to basically put Russia and China together.
Yes.
As almost one common entity, when in fact they have some very, very different goals and policies, etc. And even within each of those countries, although I'd say Russia, very much like the U.S., it doesn't matter what faction you're talking about, most of the powerful ones are imperialist. Whereas China, though, is different. China, yeah, they got some pretty imperialist capitalist factions. They also got some, pretty diehard socialists too, and there's conflict between that.
Right.
They also like to they also like to credit LaRouche as being the brains behind China's Belt and Road, which is complete horseshit, because the idea of building railroads is a hell of a lot older.
Yeah, that's right.
But they'll try and do that. Going back to the classical thing, because you will see the relatively diverse but predominantly white makeup, kind of reflecting the American population.
Mm-hmm.
But now they don't have a problem with any musician of any particular ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
What they have a problem with is music style. And
Right.
when you what they call pop music, but when you actually break it down, it's anything that was invented by Black people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, like they're cool with what, for lack of a better term, I'll call a black version of white music, like the old black church hymns and things like that.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Like their music from the earlier days.
Yeah, but when it comes to any modern music that has its roots in African people, blues, jazz, country, R&B, rock and roll, rap, they shit all over all of it.
Right.
I even heard one member wanting to invoke Saint Augustine, and that you have to look at the whole culture is corrupt. Well, then why aren't the politicians you're trying to, sway? Actually, one of them prodded me into trying to read Confessions, and I got halfway through the first quote unquote book, which isn't, the books of St. Augustine's Confessions are actually like chapters, just like kind of a book, quote unquote, of the Bible.
Right.
But I stopped halfway through the first book when the asshole said that babies are inherently sinful because they breastfeed. When I read that, I'm like, okay, if you're liking this,
that's just a little out there.
Yeah, exactly. Keep in mind, when they, I'll make the point also when they get on people because they're very much pro technology,
right?
And technology is good. They look at the space program and see that as, a big American achievement, and I can agree with that. What they want to do now, though, is they want a fusion driver program.
Right.
And okay, fusion could be good, but what none of them can answer is, what if it turns out that there is no way to do it?
Mm-hmm.
They're like, well, we wanted to get to the moon, we found a way there. Okay, yeah, that's true, but fusion as a power source may not be achievable, simply because even with fission, okay, fission, just like burning something, is a chain reaction.
Yep.
That's why it can be a power source. Okay, even wood, which is not a very efficient power source, but would never have been a source of heat if you had to strike a match and then burn just one little bit and then strike another match.
Right.
Wood provides heat because once it catches fire, it keeps burning. A fission reaction, although you got to control it, neutrons keep hitting other nuclei, creating a chain reaction. So far, there has been, in our development of fusion, it's never been a chain reaction. Just pour in a bunch of energy to create this reaction, and it does not yield the power you need to put into it. So, because fusion is not, as far as we can tell, a chain reaction, it's very questionable whether it will ever be a power source. But they persist on. Well, we found a way to get to the moon. We can find a way to make fusion, a viable power source. Well, I don't know about that. So some other things I'll talk about that I think need mentioning, and because they are very pro-tech, which in and of itself isn't bad, and they are very anti-war, and that's good, and they got very heavy, they were very much against a lot of what both Bush and especially Obama were doing on that front. They kind of ignored the fact that Trump, although he didn't start any new wars, escalated a lot of them, particularly in the area of drone strikes. Because again, Trump became, their little golden boy, despite his complete incompetence and elitism and racism. But they got on Obama's case once because after an earthquake, I forget which one it was, but it was one of the big earthquakes somewhere in the world during his 8 years.
Wait, was it in Haiti?
Could have been the one in Haiti.
Because I remember in Haiti, even the Clinton Foundation and all of these people that were just collecting donations and stuff, they were just accused of just taking the money, and nothing happened with the Haitian people.
Oh, yeah. I'm not even getting into that one, but they got on Obama's case for after one of the big earthquakes. Him in a public speech saying, well, what can we do about earthquakes? We can't predict them. And they got on his case for not having faith in the human spirit to find a way to predict earthquakes. And therefore, he's just, wanting to turn back the clock on technology, et cetera, et cetera. And in and of itself, that wouldn't be a bad argument, but here's the thing that has to be known. There was one long-term member by the name of Saul Kronberg. Now, I didn't know the guy, but I did know several people who had known him, who only a couple of years, I'm not sure the exact date, I could look it up. But he was he was part of the Leesburg office, and I knew several people there who would have been there long enough to have known him, and maybe even been his friend, who committed suicide. His wife launched a very big lawsuit blaming LPAC for putting too much stress on him, but she eventually dropped it. And there was, because they are worldwide, even if they're centered out of the U.S., there was a young English kid who was recruited into the European branches really briefly, who had gone to join them in an anti-war protest. Okay, good. Right. In Germany, by the name of Jeremiah Duggan, who ended up, death is still very mysterious. I think he was.
That name sounds familiar to me.
Yeah, he was there. There's a lot of controversy surrounding his death. The parents obviously wanted to blame the organization. I think it might have been a suicide. I think he threw himself in front of a car. I forget. I know he wound up dead.
Right. Right.
It's really questionable whether. I mean, I tend to doubt that the organization was all that responsible for either death, whether Duggan or Kronberg. Okay. Yeah. I mean, they might have made a few mistakes, but I don't think they obviously did not intentionally drive anybody to suicide. And I'm sure there were plenty of other factors involved rather than LaRouche PAC. However, going back to why I brought up their point about getting on Obama for him saying, well, we can't predict earthquakes. Here's an organization that within a span of 10 years had 2 suicides. Now, granted, they're all over the world, but still, they're not huge in numbers. One's a fluke. And it's, well, let's even if Duggan might or might not have been a suicide, who knows? And even if he wasn't, it doesn't mean they were involved. But you have 1 definite suicide, 2 potential within your organization.
Right.
They didn't do jack shit to start thinking, well, gee, how can we recognize the signs of suicide? These are people talking about innovation. We've had two people in their organizations die of suicide, and they don't think, hey, how can we train each other to start recognizing the signs?
Yeah, something doesn't seem right about that.
Exactly. So, that to me is again where they have this kind of tunnel vision and don't look outside and really ask, apply it to what's going on with themselves.
Yes.
And if there was a time, and when I was breaking away from him, even though I had pretty much already done it, one of the members, when I honestly to this day forget what it is over, but I said, yo, I disagree with this. Something that had come out. And he's like, you're disrespecting our organization, you're disrespecting Lynn, and I'm like, I had a fucking disagreement with you, chill out. I mean, it was, but he was going to that point. And it's very much the same cultiness that you see, surrounding Donald Trump. They're sycophants for now too.
So instead of answering your question, he wanted to make you look like the bad person and try to gaslight you.
Yeah, exactly. Didn't work. But again, there was, like I said, I tried to stay in contact. And I've stayed in contact with 1 or 2 people. That's about it. But one of the few, and like I said, some people who were kind of like the central folks in the Leesburg office were decent folks, but the last one of them, I won't say his name, maybe he's listening, I hope he is. He's been a good guy to me. He was kind of like the leader of when we'd go, and to do our lobbying in Congress. He was a smart guy.
Right.
Always, very intelligent. I could always talk to him usually, but last time I met up with him, he's like, "Hey, let's get together over." It was like a Starbucks or Panera or something. They were sitting down and having a chat, and he had, scheduled it such that, he only had an hour, but his spiel about what he wanted me to contribute to somehow took 55 minutes.
Yeah.
And some of the friends who I do still have some contact with, when I ever challenge the organization on what they're doing, I just get stonewalled. They'll change the subject or we'll ignore it or whatever. And frankly, the Baha'is do the same thing.
Yes, that's correct. That's absolutely correct.
And it's the same cult mentality that,
Yeah.
that you're on Donald Trump. And so that, both the Baha'i Faith and LaRouche PAC very much on the surface are proponents of peace and anti-war. Okay, great. There's unique history you find. Baha'i Faith is particularly questionable, but LaRouche PAC does have some what we might call now obscure history that they try to keep alive, and that's good. And they're very prolific in their writing. You can find stuff on a lot. But when you go beneath the surface, you find racism.
Of course.
You find imperialism. You find intolerance. And eventually you reach a point where, with both of them, it's like, I'm out of here. I can't support this. There's some good stuff, but there's too much bad stuff.
Absolutely right.
And, I hope that people in both the Baha'i Faith and LaRouche PAC will come to their senses.
Yes.
And stop being so slavish and so slavishly defending the parts of their organization that are just plain immoral and disgusting.
And I think you made a wonderful point, Brother Matt, in explaining these different aspects of your experience with the Baha'i Faith and the LaRouche group, and how you've been able to pierce through the veil of what appears nice and fluffy at the surface, but there is a steep darkness behind that veil. And I think you've done a wonderful job in this part 8, educating the listeners about what it is, and even those that are finding their way away from Dietrich and Moon, to not basically try to find something else to substitute that, but be vigilant and mindful of everyone and everything that you come across on this path.
Yeah, well, and ask questions. And again, people are going to, I don't blame anybody who wants to find something else, because that's human.
Yeah.
And that desire to be part of something bigger than yourself is great. But unfortunately, it can be used.
Indeed.
To get you doing some very nefarious stuff. And, and just going back to the beginning, that's why I did it now. Because even though I'm hoping that this can be available to anyone, and who knows whose ears it will fall on that need it. I mean, granted, we don't have much of an audience, but we've obviously I've gotten a little bit more of an audience. I mean, unfortunately, yeah, I'm kind of bummed that of all the podcasts I did with you, the one where I take down Dietrich and especially Moon's bullshit is is my most listened to.
Yeah,
but okay,
yeah.
if obviously there are people who have left that group, which I don't know if I'd call it a cult just because they were so damn small, but definitely cult-like.
Oh, and they're done because they've been exposed by not only us, but so many other people that have came out against them and made videos against them, made Facebook posts against them. So these people are done. It's a domino effect, and that's it. They've been exposed for who they are, and whoever chooses to associate with them, despite having all this information out there, then that's on them.
Yeah, but I figured since there are other people besides yourself getting away, that
Yep.
I think it's a good time to say this and just how keep yourself in check, because it's just the way someone getting out of a relationship can go to another one just to be in a relationship to kind of ignore and kind of numb the pain of the previous breakup.
Yep, but that's what happens is if they don't heal themselves first, then they'll end up damaging other people from jumping from one relation to another.
Yeah, and in the case of organizations, I'm not saying don't join another organization, but I'm saying just likewise, you don't have to not get into another relationship, but you got to figure out what went wrong. As you said, you got to heal yourself, and you've got to be a little more watchful, or you'll get right back into the same shit.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, brother Matt, thank you for this part 8. It has truly been a pleasure, and I thank you for imparting your wisdom upon us as always. Any closing thoughts for the listeners and viewers before we conclude for part 9 in the future?
No, I think I summed it up. I'd say that if there's anybody out there who comes across this podcast who wants to talk to me about whatever, dealing with whatever shit organizations they've gotten themselves into, if I can help, they can look me up. I'm not going to say I'm available 24/7. I got a life like anybody else, but I'll help where I can.
Thank you, brother Matt. And where can people find you if they wish to contact you?
I'm on Facebook. That's probably my best initial contact, and from there, I'll probably switch you over to my line or my Telegram. I'm not giving those out because I'll give those out on an individual basis.
Oh, of course, and that's your private information. So anybody that's listening, you can look up Brother Matt Douglas on Facebook and make contact from there, and that's it.
Yeah, I'm on your friends list, so somebody's listening probably can find you and then find me through your thing. So
yeah, of course.
I guess right now, the picture that I'm using is actually one of me and Sheikh Wahid with pictures of the Bob and Sufi Azal in the background.
Sounds good.
But yeah, that my Facebook profile changes, but I'm a guy who's balding on top with long red hair in the back, so I guess that makes me relatively hard to miss. So
yeah. Well, thank you, brother Matt, and until we conclude for part 9, Nur alaikum.
Nur alaikum, bro.